I welcome you to this, the third program in our series of explorations of how contemporary issues may be understood and addressed through Catholic social justice teaching. Economic storms and turmoil have highlighted great economic disparities within this nation and throughout the world. These glaring disparities raise questions about economic and social justice and how these might be addressed. Last summer, on the occasion of Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Carter Doherty wrote an op-ed column in the New York Times entitled Catholicism as Antidote to Turbo-Capitalism. This column caught the attention of Dr. Rochelle Rollins, who is with us tonight, and who suggested that further exploration of this issue would be especially appropriate for this CNR community. Joining her tonight are three colleagues who have agreed that this topic deserves their attention, their expertise, and our further thought and conversation. Each of our panel members has had to struggle to condense what could easily be material for several courses. Each will present a perspective to our topic, Caritas and capitalism. After the individual presentations, they will have an opportunity to interact together, followed by a question and answer period with you, the audience. Our panel this evening, in order of presentation, is Dr. Daniel Garcia, Assistant Professor of History in the School of Arts and Sciences, who will provide historical context of capitalism. Dr. Rochelle Rollins, Associate Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Social Sciences Division in the School of Arts and Sciences, who will discuss work and human dignity. Father Joseph Flynn, our chaplain, who will provide an overview of Catholic social teaching, especially as found in papal encyclicals as they address capitalism and social justice issues. Finally, Dr. Elizabeth Brinkman, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies in the School of Arts and Sciences, will discuss the implications of capitalism for the College of New Rochelle as Catholic Women's College in 2009. Dr. Garcia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Robin, Father Joe, Elizabeth, for helping all of us to organize this panel here tonight. Tonight I will be giving a presentation on the history of unfettered or unrestrained capitalism in the United States. In his recent encyclical, Pope Benedict reminded the world that the economic sphere is an essential component of human activity, which should be governed in an ethical manner. While not rejecting capitalism, Pope Benedict, among countless other critics of our current financial crisis, has condemned what he has observed as unrestrained capitalism. Benedict's message demands a systemic change, a transformation of a cynical and profit-driven system to an economic system based on morality and social well-being. To understand, let alone remedy the economic catastrophe, however, we find ourselves in need to examine the historical development of free market capitalism in the United States. An historical grounding of American capitalism has been largely overlooked by mainstream political and economic analysts who choose to locate our current financial crisis in the politics of the Bush administration. Some analysts, using contemporary history as their guide, root corruption and fiscal criminality in the neoliberal revolution, which was successfully pursued by the Reagan administration in the 1980s. This is most certainly true. The movement to deregulate industries and cut social spending has led to our present financial crisis. Only twice before over the last century has 5% of the national income gone to families in the upper 1/100% of the income distribution. This being right before the United States entered World War I and the late 1920s before the stock market crash. Comparing the excesses of America's executive class to the opulence of the 19th century robber barons, the economist Paul Krugman noted that we are now living in a new Gilded Age, as extravagant as the original. The consolidation of wealth among a very small class of elites at the expense of the vast majority of people does offer disturbing parallels to the inequality of the Gilded Age. However, it represents only a small slice of a continuous history of unbridled American capitalism reaching far back to the colonial world of North America. The colonial elite, even before the American Revolution, participated in Great Britain's imperial struggle, and through the slave trade, the stealing of Native American land and the exploitation of its own working peoples laid the foundation for American capitalism. Without Indian land, the developments in nearly 2 centuries of colonial history would have been unthinkable. During the 17th and 18th centuries, land was the principal means of production in America. Profits originating from the land and from the colonial peoples who labored on the land became concentrated in the hands of the emerging colonial elite. A disparity existed between landless laborers and the landed gentry, leaving the colonies constantly on the verge of servile rebellion. The brazen accumulation of wealth at the top of colonial society was not lost on the impoverished indentured servants and slaves. By 1675, poor blacks and whites, slaves and indentured servants rebelled in Virginia against their conditions and the corruption of their colonial masters, burning Jamestown to the ground. Nathaniel Bacon, the leader of the revolt, wrote a manifesto decrying the corruption of the Tidewater gentry, arguing that, quote, "The poverty of the country is such that all the power and sway has got into the hands of the rich, who by extortious advantages have the common people in their debt, have always curbed and oppressed them in all manners of ways." Politics in colonial America revolved around how best to channel the choicest parcels of land to those closest to the seats of political power. 150 years of these power arrangements directly informed how wealth was distributed after the American Revolution. James Madison noted that after the Revolution, the property of this country is absolutely concentrated in a very few hands. But Madison, like other landed elites of the new republic, opposed the redistribution of property after the Revolution and ensured that only white, male, property-owning elites could participate in the newfound democracy. By the 19th century, the United States was well on the way to establishing a basis for an iniquitous and divided class system based on a commercial society. Visiting the United States in the early 19th century, de Tocqueville was astounded by the greed of the emergent entrepreneurial class. "I know of no other country," opined de Tocqueville, "where love of money has such a grip on men's hearts, or where stronger scorn is expressed for the theory of permanent equality of property." In the early to mid-19th century, the United States went through a commercial or market revolution, made possible by vast amounts of cotton grown and harvested by the slaves in the South, and by an exploited and overworked force of female textile workers in the North. The wealthy were reaping profits from the labor of slaves and immigrant workers, which in turn were paving the way for the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. The development of the cotton gin, the expansion of fertile land, and the proliferation of slavery were directly linked to unthinkable profits. World capitalism could not progress without a massive expansion of slavery in the American South. Proponents of the free market tend to overlook the historic role the federal government played in the development of capitalism, before, during, and after the Industrial Revolution. Pundits of the free enterprise system invariably argue that the 19th century market was not fettered with government muddling, but was guided by what 18th century economist Adam Smith termed as the invisible hand of the market. However, the historian Howard Zinn argued that government continually intervened in the economy, helping and defending the interests of the wealthy classes. It would raise tariffs higher and higher to help manufacturers, give subsidies to shipping industries, and 100 million acres of land, free land, to the railroads. It would use the armed forces to clear the Indians off their land, to put down labor uprisings, to intervene in Latin American countries for the benefit of American growers, bankers, and investors. No institution was more significant in the growth of American capitalism than the business corporation. The federal government, after the Civil War, instituted new laws that adjusted to the expansion of corporations. The Industrial Revolution and railways, in particular, fueled large-scale enterprise and corporations. fueled large-scale enterprises and corporations and began to proliferate in Europe and the United States from the 1850s onwards. Large corporations emerged in the 1870s as free trade and unfettered capitalism sparked a period of economic globalization comparable to what we are experiencing today. Much like today, corporations gained enough influence over legislators to rewrite the rules governing their existence, undoing many of the checks and balances placed upon them. Managers were no longer liable for damage a company caused to its workers' health. Charters could be granted for an unlimited time, and in 1886, the United States Supreme Court ruled that a corporation was a natural person and therefore protected by the Bill of Rights. Corporations were now blessed with the individual rights and liberties of a citizen of the United States. By the end of the 19th century, public concern about corporate exploitation, factory conditions, and child labor reached new heights. Labor movements grew in strength, challenging capitalism and demanding radical social transformation. Progressives in the early decades of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries were successful in pushing through the laws that managed the excesses of monopolies and corporate trusts. Legislature governing child labor and working conditions for industrial laborers. After World War I, industrialists retaliated against the appeal of progressivism, socialism, and anarcho-syndicalism. In a nationwide roundup known as the Palmer Raids, federal and local authorities rounded up, jailed, and deported hundreds of suspected communists, effectively breaking the back of the progressive movement which had helped regulate and restrain the excesses of corporate power. To cleanse the country of these progressive sentiments, the National Association of Manufacturers launched a PR campaign framing workers as corporate citizens indispensable to a free market society. They launched welfare programs for workers and a wide range of philanthropic activities. The speculation and excesses of the 1920s collapsed into the Depression of the 1930s. Those who benefited the least from the expansion, the majority of Americans, suffered the most during the Depression. The anger of the population, coupled with the memory of past abuses, led to much more significant reforms of the corporate economic system. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs assuaged much of the anger and guilt and arguably saved the country from much more severe civil reactions. In addition, congressional hearings were held, and in 1941, Congress released its report entitled Investigation of Concentration of Economic Power, which concluded that the principal instrument of the concentration of economic power and wealth has been the corporate charter with unlimited power. In 1933, Roosevelt's New Deal introduced sweeping reforms to keep corporations in check, including regulations, workers' rights, a social safety net, and progressive taxation. Similar legislation was passed in many European countries. Over the next few decades, corporations continued to dominate economies, but their rights were relatively balanced with the rights of citizens through the influence of labor unions and consumer and environmental movements that emerged in the 1960s and 70s. But the corporate elite embarked on a campaign to undermine the gains of the New Deal and to minimize the role that government played in social and economic life. In the 1970s, politics of laissez-faire capitalism emerged. Milton Friedman argued that the greatest good would be achieved by basing all business decisions on maximizing profits for shareholders. He also called for the removal of all government intervention and oversight, arguing that the most significant gains in capitalist development took place under the system of laissez-faire in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Friedman's school of thought, known as neoliberalism, underpinned the 1980s Reagan-Thatcher era of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization that opened the world's markets for corporations. The celebrated journalist, Naomi Klein, argued that the neoliberal agenda over the past decades relied on social, political, and economic catastrophes to drastically reform the global economy along neoliberal principles. Disaster capitalism, as Klein calls it, is the fear and disorientation that follow disasters, uses the fear and disorientation that follow disasters, which were then harnessed for radical social and economic re-engineering. In the United States and around the world, social contracts between state, labor, and industry were broken down and replaced by the highly vaunted mandates of free trade. eliminating government-controlled economic oversight, crushing labor unions, privatizing welfare and healthcare, and drastically reducing social spending have removed the checks and balances between the government, big business, and the people. Moreover, deregulation and privatization have encouraged the wild economic speculation and corruption underlying our current financial crisis. Though the Bush administration has revealed the most cynical manifestations of an unfettered economy, it represents just one episode in the history of American capitalism. Understanding our current predicament in a broader historical context allows us to examine capitalism in a more systemic manner, a system of power relations that has historically diverted the fruits of economic development into the hands of a small segment of society. Noting the ineffectiveness of the American free enterprise model, Pope Benedict argued that the current state of capitalism is obsolete. In his encyclical, Benedict has forced open a space wherein Americans can frankly assess, reevaluate, and hopefully redefine the character of global capitalism. He is encouraging a discussion that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Benedict's suggestion that the economic sphere is part of and parcel of human activity is not a new one, but it profoundly resonates in a world debilitated by the ravages of unrestrained capitalism.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia, for setting this up so nicely. Also, thank you, Dr. Bailey, for organizing this panel tonight. As Dr. Bailey noted earlier, this July I was reading the New York Times, and I saw a piece entitled "Catholicism as an Antidote to Turbo-Capitalism." Turbo-capitalism, the phrase coined by Edward Lukács, refers to an accelerated rate of structural change that's brought about by deregulation, privatization, and globalization of markets since, generally speaking, the Reagan and Thatcher administrations, i.e. neoliberalism, economic structures. These developments have brought benefits to a lot of peoples and a lot of economies around the world, but at the same time, there have been many costs. We have seen reduced real wages, greater income inequality, increased alienation among those who are excluded from global markets, and volatility in markets and economies that have marked the past 30 years of capitalism. So when I read the headline, "Catholicism as Antidote to Turbo-Capitalism," I thought, well, I just have to see what is this antidote. The Times writer told of a man named Marx who had written a book called Das Kapital, which presented a trenchant critique of capitalism. This may sound familiar to you already. So I thought, this is news. But the article is actually about Reinhard Marx, who is Archbishop of Munich. His book, Das Kapital, has been a bestseller in Germany. As Dr. Garcia explained a moment ago, this work that he is doing has both informed and spoken back to Pope Benedict's recent encyclical, Charity and Truth. And the message of both of these texts is that today's troubled economies need to reconnect with fundamental Christian values to be restored to health, and particularly that incorporating Catholic social teachings can help to create a more just economy that provides for the common good. The introduction to the new Das Kapital is a letter to the first Marx in which the Archbishop follows traditional Catholic teaching, i.e. he rejects revolutionary Marxist solutions. But as he surveys the troubled global financial system and the growing economic insecurity of ordinary people, the Archbishop wonders in this piece, was Marx's critique of capitalism right after all? Certainly, as you're all aware, stabilizing financial markets, staving off economic depression, economic recession is now the overwhelming priority for governments, for central banks, for regulatory agencies around the world. And proposed solutions to today's troubles certainly differ. Everybody agrees, though, that the current situation is truly dire and also difficult to really understand. One writer noted that nobody younger than 80 years old has experienced such a rapid decline in global confidence and economic activity. Yesterday, the BBC World Service released a global poll that found that only 11% of those who were questioned, 11% across 27 countries, felt that global capitalism today is working well. Not great, just well. So, certainly this is an issue. As Dr. Garcia noted earlier, Karl Marx also lived through an era of rapid globalization, and he was moved by the kind of glaring inequalities between rich and poor that we see today within both domestic economies and across countries and international economies. Marx thought that work should bring personal fulfillment and that labor should not be treated as a simple commodity. So he foreshadowed some of today's controversies about outsourcing and about things like poor working conditions in developing countries. Marx also identified how profits were taking an ever bigger share of the economy at the expense of wages, which again we see happening today also. The Catholic Church also has long been critical of these self-same aspects of capitalism, as my colleagues will shortly explain, I think, but has generally speaking rejected communism and Marxist revolution in favor of reform. But still, as Archbishop Marx wrote to Karl Marx in his own version of Das Kapital, quote, "There's a question that won't leave me in peace. At the end of the 20th century, when the capitalist West defeated the communist East in the battle between systems, were we too quick to dismiss you and your economic theories?" Now, tonight I would just like to briefly propose that the social teachings of the Catholic Church and the ideas of Karl Marx do in fact share an emphasis that leads both to much of their critique of capitalism and which can form the basis for a suggestion of a third way between capitalism and communism. To wit, both Catholic social teachings and Marx argue for the primacy of meaningful work in securing human dignity. It is often said that Karl Marx conceived of humans as homo faber, meaning man the maker. Marx believed that the capacity for labor was an essential human characteristic, in fact, the essential human characteristic. And so he viewed productive activity, productive work, as an essential human activity, which can be rewarding when it is pursued freely. Under capitalism, though, Marx argued, labor is not free. And instead of being something that leads to the fulfillment of human capacity, labor under capitalism becomes something alienating, something dehumanizing, something that Marx said makes men miserable, mortifies their flesh, and ruins their minds. Under capitalism, the worker has diminished responsibilities and diminished rights and control over the work process. The worker doesn't own the tools with which he or she works, does not control the process or the pace, does not own the final product. The worker doesn't set the organizational goals, does not have the right to make decisions about the work, and is therefore reduced to a mere cog in the machine. Work becomes a necessary activity, but it's not a creative one or a satisfying one. This leads to Marx's argument that it's only under communism that men could, through work, come to realize their true nature, their human nature, their communal nature. At the same time, as I said earlier, like Marx, Catholic social teaching posits that work is more than just a way for people to make a living, but that full human development requires meaningful work. Among the foundational principles of Catholic social teaching is a belief in the inherent human dignity of every person. This is the grounding for CST's emphasis on human rights. The core principles of the dignity of work and the rights of workers also derive from this foundational belief in human dignity. For the dignity of work to be respected and accomplished, the basic rights of workers have to be respected. Their rights to decent and fair wages, their rights to the organization and joining of unions, their rights to economic initiative, to private property, and especially the basic right of all individuals to productive and meaningful work. So, As we see, both Karl Marx and Catholic social teaching emphasize the importance of dignity through productive work. Yet, both capitalism and communism have historically failed to provide opportunities for everyone to have dignity through work. Even if you don't agree with Marx that work under capitalism is inherently alienating, you must acknowledge that global capitalist economies have provided many people with nothing more than unemployment, underemployment, outsourcing, poor work conditions, unfair wages. Communism, despite Marx's hopes, also failed to provide productive work for many people. You know, you may have heard the famous Soviet-era saying, "We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us." So, if neither capitalism nor communism can provide for the Catholic nor the Marxist promise of the full development of human beings through the dignity of work, what are we left with? Both capitalism and communism tend to insist that workers and owners are separate and distinct species of being. That capitalists and the proletariat are different, that workers and owners, corporate owners, in Dr. Garcia's talk, are completely separate. But this is not necessarily so. This is propaganda from both of those systems. We've been encouraged to believe in a false dichotomy between proletariat and capitalist, between worker and owner. But what if the worker and the owner are one and the same? What if we have not unbridled capitalism with its triumphal owners, with their huge profits, not failed communism with its ubiquitous workers standing on line to buy food they can't afford that's not there anyway, but yet a third C, if you will. Not capitalism, not communism. I'm talking about cooperatives. Cooperatives collapse the division between worker and owner, allowing all workers to achieve dignity through their productive work. I'll just give you a definition of cooperatives according to the International Cooperative Alliance based in Geneva. Quote, a cooperative is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Cooperatives are based on the values of self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, and solidarity. The ICA estimates that 750 million people worldwide are involved in some kind of cooperative economic activity. It's not something you tend to hear about, though, when you look at the news, that's for sure. So cooperative enterprise would be one possible way, I argue, of realizing the promise of dignity through work for all people. In an era in which transnational corporate capitalism claims to be the only economic alternative to hardcore Marxist collectivism or the scary specter of so-called socialism, it's important to remember that this, too, is a false dichotomy. Every day, in every country in the world, cooperative business enterprises demonstrate that capitalism, collectivism, the common good, and the individual interest can and do coexist. So I'll give you two examples of this. On one end of the scale, you have the Mondragon cooperatives of the Basque people of Spain. This started in 1956 when 5 students of a technical school that was started by a Catholic priest to teach social doctrine began a cooperative enterprise making paraffin stoves. By 1959, the movement had its own bank. Today, the Mondragon Cooperative is one of the 12 largest business enterprises in Spain. It employs around 30,000 workers in close to 100 cooperative enterprises, holds gross assets of $20 billion, and produces everything from machine tools to refrigerators to electronic equipment. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, on the other end of the scale, there's a 5-member coffee growers cooperative in northeastern Nicaragua. 5 families share the workload and profits from their fields. 9 years ago, a woman named Rosa Emilia Centeno and 4 other women left behind their jobs as hired coffee cultivators and harvesters and started their own collective with some help from an organization called La Femme, which is a local organization empowering women in agriculture. To get them started, La Femme donated a little more than 52 acres of land suitable for coffee farming. trained the women in quality control and the production of organic fertilizer. In 2007, Catholic Relief Services began organizing a new program that they felt would be a good fit for the La Femme beneficiaries. This is a program that's funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development, and it's a program that helps Nicaraguan farmers overcome technical shortcomings so that they can take advantage of emerging markets. It also has as one of its aims to promote gender equity through productive work. So now, the members of this coffee cooperative, all 5 of them, are not only able to better provide for their families, but they also have much more control over their own lives. So cooperative enterprises provide a third way, beyond communism, beyond capitalism, to achieve dignity through work by expanding the definition of the worker to include the responsibilities and rights of the owner. There's no alienation from work when workers' rights are assured by empowered worker owners rather than negotiated between workers and owners. So I will let Rosa, who is one of the women in the Coffee Growers Cooperative, have the last word. She said, "In the past, we only knew how to cultivate, how to cut the coffee, but we worked for others. Now we are owners."
Thank you, Dr. Garcia, Dr. Rawlings, and we're anxiously awaiting Dr. Brinkman's presentation. But I want to thank you too, Dr. Bailey, for the invitation to become part of this panel. I've had this urge, this feeling, with this kind of a background, I should be really singing an ode to the Communist Manifesto. But I'll do my job. I'd like to approach the question of Caritas and capitalism by raising 3 issues in the form of 3 questions. First question is, what has Catholic social teaching to say about capitalism? The second question is, does capitalism have any redeeming qualities? And third, what does the Pope Benedict XVI's newest encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Love in Truth, have to offer capitalism? First question, has Catholic social teaching had anything to say about capitalism? Let me preface my remarks by pointing out that in the 110 years of focused Catholic social teaching, the popes were reading the signs of the times and allowing the context to dictate the need to speak out. Historians and various authors have pointed out the many abuses of the Industrial Revolution, which fostered such writings as Karl and Engels' The Communist Manifesto in 1848, and Karl Marx's Capital in 1867. On the other hand, Catholicism offered its analysis with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical, The Condition of Labor, Rerum Novarum, in 1891. Among other things, Leo XIII pointed out, 1, too few people control production. 2, concentrated wealth produces greed. 3, many working people and their families are destitute. Leo XIII responded by calling for action that would, 1, seek a more equitable distribution of property and goods. 2, require employers to pay wages adequate for the support of workers and their families. And challenge the rich to give to the poor. 3rd, protect workers' rights to organize into associations to seek just wages and working conditions. As you can see, Pope Leo XIII spoke not only to this time, but also speaks to our time. He cites the effects of capitalism without naming it directly. The condition of labor came to be the foundational Catholic social teaching for all the following social encyclicals for the last 110 years. When the world experienced the Great Depression of 1929, which lasted until the start of World War II in 1941, Pope Pius XI published another encyclical in 1931, 40 years after the condition of labor. The encyclical was entitled On Reconstructing the Social Order, Quadragesimo Anno. It cited such issues as 1. Free competition has destroyed itself. Economic power is concentrated in the hands of a few. 2. Workers do not own the means of production and receive unjust wages. And 3. Public authority has become a slave to human greed. It sounds as if Pope Leo XIII's teaching fell on deaf ears, not only in society, but also in the Catholic Church. In the early 1930s, when along with the financial meltdown, poor land management, and drought turned the Great Plains states into a dust bowl, unemployment soared to 25% in 1933. Millions of people in the largest cities stood in long bread and soup lines. While no one is saying the Great Recession of 2008 will get that bad, we have already seen troubling parallels. An under-regulated financial sector, banks, too big to fail, failed, and had to be bailed out. Businesses collapsed, mortgage defaults and bankruptcies skyrocketed as the economy based on consumption and credit ground to a halt, undermined by the voracious appetite of wealth known as greed. As you may know, there were a number of other encyclicals that spoke to the issue of capitalism. I do not have to say, though, that both Pope I apologize. I lost the page. I'm sorry, I lost the page somewhere in the transition. Now it's a matter of trying to find out. Excuse me. As well, time prevents the further elaboration. But I think this lays the foundation for our next question. Second, does capitalism have any redeeming qualities? Here I rely on my two colleagues who have offered their insights into the workable and unworkable elements of capitalism. If we begin with the premise that capitalism is meant to help people in society to live a decent and happy life, free from worries and insecurity, then capitalism plays a major role in contributing to society's organic and healthy growth. However, in looking at the four principles of capitalism, we are faced with the question of how much is enough. These principles are, first, private ownership of property, unlimited or limited. Second, personal profit, maximum profit. What? At whose expense? Third, competition, family stores versus transnational corporations leading to monopolies. And finally, as Dr. Garcia mentioned, laissez-faire government policy, hands off, unregulation. And so Adam Smith's presumption that the invisible hand would take care of everything obviously doesn't work. And I say, only if you have a conscience and ethical principles are applied by individuals. I do have to say, though, that both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI did acquiesce to the application of capitalism for society, but with major restrictions. Pope John Paul II elaborates his position in his 1991 encyclical, The 100th Year. He states, quote, "It would appear that on the level of individual nations and international relations, the free market is the most effective and efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to the needs. But this is true only if those resources which are solvent, insofar as they are endowed with purchasing power, and for those resources which are marketable, insofar as they are capable of obtaining a satisfactory price." Unquote. Pope Benedict XVI seems to concur when he states the market can be a negative force, not because it is by nature, but because a certain ideology can make it so. Pope Benedict recognizes that it is people who use the market for their own means without any ethical consideration that they are therefore they are the problem. It sounds as if there may be a way to reconcile and redeem capitalism. However, we need to look more closely at Pope Benedict's analysis. Our third question. What does Pope Benedict XVI's newest encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, have to offer capitalism? Caritas is an important addition to the Catholic social teaching and was being written before the context of the Great Recession of 2008. But there had to be a rewriting to bring in the recession into consideration. In general, Caritas in Veritate is an appeal for an overhaul of the entire global economic order, to rebuild the former system, even with more regulation, would condemn whole nations to be continually exploited in order to preserve the great pyramids of wealth for a few at the expense of the many. We need new ideas that acknowledge the inherent dignity of all global participants, ideas that accept environmental responsibility, ideas that create new systems with enforceable rules that respect the rights of all people to sit at the table of sacred and shared resources and development. This would demand big changes from all of us. Pope Benedict states, quote, the primary capital to be safeguarded and valued is the human person in his or her integrity. In particular, the Pope says that the global dimension of the financial crisis is an expression of the moral failure of greedy financiers and investors, of the lack of oversight by national governments, and of a lack of understanding that the global economy required internationally recognized global control. He calls for, quote, a profoundly new way of understanding business, unquote, that recognizes that the investors are not the company's only stakeholders. Pope Benedict states, quote, the entire economy and finance, not just certain sectors, must be used in an ethical way so as to create suitable conditions for human development, unquote. Pope Benedict XVI lays the foundation for his comments on the economic order and the ethical principles by which all should live in an interrelationship of love and truth, when he says, quote, in the present social and cultural context where there is a widespread tendency to relativize truth, practicing charity in truth helps people to understand that adhering to the values of Christianity is not merely useful, but essential for building a good society. He continues to offer practical application to these principles when he states, quote, in the economic sphere, the principal form of assistance needed by the developing countries is that of allowing and encouraging the gradual penetration of their products into the international market, thus making it possible for these countries to participate fully in international economic life, unquote. And again, quote, once profit becomes the exclusive goal, if it is produced by improper means and without the common good as its ultimate goal, it risks destroying wealth and creating poverty. Pope Benedict XVI cites the various principles enjoined by the past encyclicals, such as the principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, participation, and the principle of social mortgage, which reminds us that all creation has been given by God to be shared, not hoarded. In concluding his encyclical letter, Pope Benedict offers that could be considered his synopsis of the path to take to move forward at this time of crisis. Quote, an awareness of God's undying love sustains us in our laborious and stimulating work for justice and the development of peoples amid successes and failures in the careless pursuit of a just ordering of human affairs. God's love calls us to move beyond the limited and the ephemeral. It gives us the courage to continue seeking and working for the benefit of all. Finally, I would like to attempt to offer a humble answer to my initial questions Catholic social teaching has. First, the Catholic Church clearly confronted the excesses and the sinfulness of unbridled capitalism in each of its social encyclicals, from Pope Leo XIII to Pope Benedict XVI. Second, offered less than a hopeful possibility for the redemption of the capitalist free market system by stating a number of restrictions. And finally, third, throughout Pope Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, called for the actualization of the various social teaching principles, primarily the primacy of the human person and the preferential option for the poor. Thank you.
Dr. Garcia, Dr. Rollins, and Father Joe. And also to Joe Bailey for organizing this panel. The first three speakers have done all the heavy lifting, so I'm just going to have some reflections in a slightly different vein, looking at the implications of Caritas in Veritate for Catholic education in general and the College of New Rochelle in particular. And my reflections are sparked in part because this is a continuation of the Founders Day programming. So I thought that would really kind of bring us back to the reason for the celebration or for the panel. So the College of New Rochelle, as all educational institutions in the United States, exists in a culture of capitalism, which places faith in the invisible hand of the market for, shall we say, since I'm a theologian, salvation. In this market, in this culture, choice and competition are important, and everything turns into a commodity that can be bought and sold in a free market of choices. And it's in this culture, in this context, that colleges have to recruit students in the educational market. In that context, not only for colleges, really for everything, branding becomes ultimately important. And I just want to tell a little story, really on myself and my religious order, which is not the Ursulines. I'm on the board of trustees of one of our network of schools that were grounded by my order, the Religious of the Sacred Heart, and was at the first meeting for me, at the first trustees meeting. I'm newly on the board, and the topic of Catholic identity came up. And much to my dismay, I mean, I'm very used to this discussion, but even on this board of trustees, there was a lot of sort of tension around it and discussion. And one of the members of the board launched into, and part of the discussion, let me just set it up, was, is this school Catholic or is this school Sacred Heart? And there was, the faction that was insisting we're Sacred Heart, and the other faction that was insisting, no, we're Catholic. And I was sitting there going, we're Catholic and we're Sacred Heart. Or we're Sacred Heart, which means we're Catholic. But in the midst of this, one of the board members pipes up and says, to say that we're Catholic is to confuse our brand. We have to keep our brand clear. Our brand is Sacred Heart. And Sacred Heart means this, this, and this, and Catholic means all these other things that are not particularly positive, like hierarchy coming down and visiting sisters and everything we don't like about the Catholic Church, including parochial schools and all the bad memories we have of those. The key to a clear brand, or to a brand, and frankly, like I said, I mean, 2 weeks ago now, 1 week ago, the Obama marriage was labeled a formidable brand on the cover of of the New York Times Magazine. So this is sort of part of the culture we live in. Everything is brand and everything has to be branded. And key to that is clear and simple identity, which can be packaged as a distinctive message or in a distinctive image to appeal to the consuming public. In our case, those in the market for a good college education. And there's also pressure for clearly measurable results that support and or underscore the claims of one's brand and show one's position in relationship to the competitors. Now let me just emphasize that I'm not criticizing what the admissions offices of Catholic schools and colleges have to do. This is the reality in which they are. And in which we have to work to fulfill our mission.
Another piece of the reality in which we're doing that is the increasingly scary and uncertain signs of the times. We're in a reality right now of global warming, which we're hearing more and more about, environmental degradation, the wars that have followed 9/11 that we can't seem to extricate ourselves from, huge disparities in wealth nationally and internationally, and of course the economic implosion, which has really added a whole new or has emphasized uncertainty and uncertainty. Both the culture of capitalism and this global crisis, I believe, are pressures for simplification, for clear identity, and for easy identification of good and bad and right and wrong. And I'm not much into pop culture at all. I don't watch TV or movies very often. But I don't know how many of you have noticed that there seems to be a lot of sort of apocalyptic type TV shows. I mean, the one that I noticed just yesterday was I think it's called the Nostradamus Effect, something like that. And that really, I mean, it religiously or theologically speaking, I think that that's sort of a symptom of the kind of fearful situation we're living in, which traditionally and historically gives rise to apocalyptic thinking. And we see also in the face of the context that we're in, in a world of increasing ambiguity, the demand for certainty, and which we also see in the kind of spiritual longing, spiritual searching that I certainly experience in my students, a real interest in following questions about or exploring questions about the meaning of life, the deeper questions of life. As well as this tendency to oversimplify and view reality as powers of good pitted against powers of evil, where good must defeat evil in the end. And I think we see it in the rise of the kinds of fundamentalisms that are becoming more and more prevalent. And I mean not only religious fundamentalisms, but also political fundamentalisms, which place a blind faith in entrenched positions. And I think this can be true on the left and on the right. If you watch the talk shows, right, there's this polarization that's rooted in absolute stances which must defend against the evil influences of the opposition, which must defeat the opposition, rather than engaging with the opposition with the goal of moving towards a greater truth together. Religiously, we're hearing a lot about Islamic fundamentalism, but it's also in Christianity. Most often we think of it in terms of biblical fundamentalism, putting blind faith in a literal interpretation of the Bible. But it's also found in the Catholic Church, where there's an increasing tendency to put blind faith in the authority of the magisterium, which might explain, at least in part, some of what's going on with U.S. bishops, and the retreat into what seem to be clear, certain answers from the past. So we want nuns back in habits, and we want to reassert very clear, defined structures of hierarchically ordered relationships. And the problem, the fact of the matter is that this kind of yearning for what I will call fundamentalism flies in the face, at least within the Catholic Church, flies in the face of the Catholic intellectual and social tradition at its best. The Catholic intellectual tradition combines faith, and reason. Going back to the earliest Christian church, when the church fathers and mothers, who we tend to forget, turned to Greek philosophy for the language and the intellectual constructs to try and make sense of the Christian faith. And since then, the Catholic Church, Catholic Christianity, has rejected fideism. And we see this in the latest encyclical, an unreasoned faith. Faith and reason in the Catholic tradition have always gone together. We also see it in the rise of the universities, which were an outgrowth of the monasteries and cathedral schools of medieval Europe. In the social tradition, so in the intellectual tradition it's faith and reason. In the social tradition it's church and state. And so that faith is not simply a private and individual matter. Our faith, our lives of faith have social and public implications. People of faith have a duty to live lives publicly and privately that are informed by their faith. And the church has a right and a duty to speak to its members about matters of social concern. And it has always asserted the right and duty to engage in civil discourse, just as any other group or institution in society has. Which is why social encyclicals in general, including Caritas and Veritate in particular, address themselves not only to the Catholic Church, the Catholics within the Church, but also to all men and women of goodwill, is the phrase they use, or all people of goodwill. So Caritas and Veritate is situated in this Catholic intellectual and social tradition. Perhaps even more than some other encyclicals, which perhaps more than some other encyclicals illustrates that a simplistic, unambiguous worldview is not compatible with this tradition. And we can see that just in the reactions to the encyclical itself, where on the one hand, people who would think of themselves as liberal or progressive are inclined to focus on Benedict's emphasis on solidarity, on concern for the environment, on his call for international institutions to address international problems, and so forth, sort of the things that adhere to the hearts of progressives. Conservatives, on the other hand, we'll call them that for now, are inclined to dismiss these aspects of the encyclical in favor of those that support their pro-capitalist and pro-life ideologies. And most notoriously is George Weigel's critique of this latest encyclical, in which he advises people to read it with a red and a gold pen, the gold pen to basically highlight everything that's supposedly genuinely Benedict XVI, and therefore true Catholic teaching, and the red pen to get rid of everything that doesn't agree with Weigel's idea of what's right. In fact, both what the progressives like and what the conservatives like, both are in the encyclical, which reflects the integrative vision of faith that first seemed to become evident in John Paul II's writings. And I still remember it was his Evangelium Vitae, where people started to say, this is a social encyclical dealing with life issues, with those issues that are usually sort of sequestered into the realm of bioethics and sexual ethics and so on. What I mean by it being an integrative vision of faith, or being shaped by or reflecting that, is that it brings together all aspects of life: political, social, economic, personal, sexual, familial, professional. You'll find everything you like in this document and probably everything you don't like too. And it does this because it recognizes that these all coexist together. You can't simply sequester them one from the other. And that is grounded in the theological conviction that all human existence is brought together under God. Also evident this is also evidence, sort of this conviction of everything being brought together under God and everything, therefore, needing to be part of our view of how we see the world and ourselves in it, is in the introductory meditation of Caritas in Veritate on the connection between charity and truth. I mean, this is a document that's about charity in truth, or love in truth. And where Benedict XVI says that authentic charity must be grounded in truth, and that when it is, and only when it is communication, in other words, dialogue possible. And dialogue is directed, and this goes way back in the Catholic tradition. Dialogue in the Catholic tradition is directed at seeking truth wherever it may be found. So what does all of this have to do with the College of New Rochelle? I would argue that this integrative vision needs to characterize Catholic education generally and the College of New Rochelle's mission specifically. We need to provide students with the tools to counteract the pressures of oversimplification in terms of good and evil, right and wrong. We need to provide them with a place to start really thinking about how what they are learning in college, or in high school if that's where we are, but we're in college here, how that fits into a view of life, and to use sort of language coming out of the Catholic and intellectual tradition, the good life. Now obviously, as a college, in order to survive, we have to be able to clearly articulate our identity and to communicate it to those whom we hope to attract as students. But I would argue that we have to resist the temptation of focusing exclusively on meeting consumer demands, marketing the various sort of hot departments and majors, that the most popular things that people want to study right now, in order to attract students at the expense of emphasizing what ought to distinguish Catholic higher education, which is providing students with the tools to integrate knowledge into a meaningful vision of their life, an understanding of human flourishing, and of how we live well together in society. And this does not rule out specialization in various fields, as in majors, or even professional programs like social work, nursing, business. But they have to be taught in a broader, unified context, which is why I submit, at the root and at the heart, at the core of the curriculum in a truly Catholic college must be philosophy and theology. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the panel again one time if we could. I promised them that they could each ask questions. So does somebody have a question or comment they want to ask or speak to one of their colleagues? Or are you all quiet? Yes, Sean.
Dr. Brinkman, your last statement was astounding. No, but concretely, how would you see putting philosophy and theology into the curriculum any better than it is now?
You really want to know?
You told me to ask that question.
First of all, I think one semester of religious studies theology and one semester of philosophy is hardly adequate. It doesn't even provide the fundamental basis from which to really, the tools on which to really build a considered education into the major questions in the field. I mean, theology and philosophy have their own ways of thinking, their own methodology, and probably more so than any other field at the undergraduate level, I would think, most students nowadays, regardless of what religious tradition they come from, have a sorely lacking basis of any kind of academic study in theology and philosophy. And so to expect in one course over the 4 years that they're in college to really give them the framework or the tools that they need to think in a complex way about the complex reality in which our students will be working, in which our students will be living, it's just not enough.
Do I hear another question or comment from anyone in the group? Dan?
Oh, I feel thoroughly satisfied.
Very good, very good. Well, in that case, perhaps I could ask if there are any questions from anyone in the audience. Yes?
I have a question about, how realistic it is to have, additional philosophy or theology courses, given that, first of all, many of our students are working part-time already and they're very in a rush to graduate. And they are not, and they feel that they have paid already a lot of money in their education. How realistic is it?
Well, I think what you're naming is the tension, right? That our students are paying good money for an education to allow them to get into the workforce to make good money. And I would say that that's, in fact, a really problematic way of seeing what education is about. So, yes, there are financial pressures on students and on faculty and on the institution, for sure. But I think what we need, if we're really going to address this, is a really robust discussion about how we see ourselves if we really are going to say that we're Catholic. If we're not going to do that, then I don't think we can keep saying that we're a Catholic college and I think that somehow the practicalities have to be worked out. I don't think you can start with the practicalities and say, well, here are the practicalities, and now we have to make it all fit. I think we have to start with, here's what it means to be a Catholic college in the Ursuline tradition, and how do we make the practicalities work together in that reality?
Isn't it part of it, we have to worry about how sustainable the institution is. If you don't look at what the market is saying,
I'm not saying we don't. It's true. We have to exist in the current reality in which we exist, in which education, in which colleges basically are competing in a very competitive market. I also can tell you that some of the more successful Catholic colleges and universities require 2, if not 3 semesters of theology and 2, if not 3 semesters of philosophy of all of their undergraduate students, and it's not putting them out of business. So I'm not sure that sort of this focus on the practicalities is really
I think to that point, one of the things that we grapple with in the School of Nursing is, and you in the School of Arts and Science have the luxury of greater number of courses that your students can take to get the degree credit. We're limited to 60 credits of liberal arts and science and many prescribed sciences. But right now we're grappling, the faculty is grappling with just what are the underpinnings of our liberal arts and sciences. We're coming to recognize that philosophy and religion are going to be required courses. It's kind of disappointing that it may only be 1 or 2, but I think if it is just 1 or 2, then it behooves the faculty in the School of Nursing to understand how it's explicated in our own professional education. So I think that's the dialogue that would be helpful from our perspective in a professional discipline to see that yes, we are a Catholic institution with this Catholic identity and social justice teaching. then how do we, as a profession of nursing, explicate it in our discipline? So I would ask for your help.
Right now.
Are there any other questions? I would invite you to join us in the Moody Center Lounge for some coffee and cookies and further conversation. On your way there, as you leave the auditorium, there are flyers about Catholic social teaching and higher education. I would encourage you to take one if you have not already seen them. I thank you for your attendance. It is our hope that this panel presentation will be available on the web shortly. So as the two previous presentations have been and are already available. And I thank you for coming, and I thank our panel very much.